Matthew chapter 2. I'm not going to go verse by verse all the way through the book of Matthew, but these first couple of chapters are uh, I am. And the reason is because the whole narrative, it speaks to itself. I don't know how to say it, but it deserves us looking at verse by verse. Also bearing in mind that when Matthew wrote this, he didn't write it in verses. He just wrote it as the narrative of Jesus' life story. So in verse 3, after the wise men, and oh, by the way, called a Magi, and I think that's a more appropriate term, we generally call them the three wise men. There's no reason to do that. Really not. Well, the only reason there is because of a song that was written in the 1800s. We three kings of Orient are. When I was a kid, I thought it was Orient R, as in Orient letter R. But the reason for that was they brought three gifts, these Magi, in honor of Jesus. Anyway, they made their first stop in, that wasn't the first stop. They'd come a long ways. They had a lot of stops. But they went to Jerusalem, and not just to Jerusalem, but to Herod, the king of Judea. And their question was simple. Where is this one born king of the Jews? Ooh. Verse 3, when Herod heard this, he was disturbed, and all Jerusalem with him. Well, yeah, talked about that. Verse 4, when he had called together all the people's chief priests and teachers of the law, which, by the way, that was like, this was not a legislative body, not in the, Roman political structure. These were theologians and teachers. He asked them where the Messiah was to be born. Now, there's a couple of things in that, at least. One is, Herod, when you look at his life, you realize he was not a God-fearing man. He was an aggressive, megalomaniac, politician who had, his desire was more power, whatever it took. He didn't know the scriptures. But he had enough sense, I guess, to seek out people who did know the scriptures and ask them, where will the king, the Messiah, be born? Their response was, in Bethlehem in Judea. They replied, for this is what the prophet has written. And then they basically just quote from Micah, the prophet. But you, Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah. For out of you will come a ruler. He will shepherd my people, Israel. Well, that prophecy was made about 650 years before this moment when Herod seeks the wisdom and knowledge of these teachers of the law and chief priests. And then Herod decides, well, I need a time frame here. Because he knew these magi hadn't come from across the border. They were far outside the border, and their travels would have taken them considerable time. Verse 7, Herod calls the Magi secretly. This is an interesting thing. Now we have intrigue introduced into the story. Why would Herod want to do this secretly? Well, you have to conjecture on this, but my sense is he didn't want anybody else figuring this out. He needed to figure it out so he could squelch it. Herod called the Magi secretly and found out from them the exact time the star had appeared. Now, it's interesting to me that Matthew doesn't record when that time was. We have to draw some conclusions to get a sense of it. Verse 8, he sent them to Bethlehem and said, go and search carefully for the child. As soon as you find him, report to me so that I too may go and worship him. Come on. Herod was lying through his teeth and he knew it, but the Magi didn't. Verse 9, after they had heard the king, they went on their way, and the star they had seen when it rose went ahead of them until it stopped over the place where the child was. Now, if they're following a star, does it make sense to you that they would have traveled at night? I mean, I don't. Yeah, it's the only time you see stars. When they did, there was not as much ambient light in their world, but still, nighttime was the time to travel if you're following a star. And then it stopped. It stopped over the place where the child was. Now, our Christmas cards and, social media memes, they have the Magi arriving at the stable. No, read on. When they saw the star, they were overjoyed. Well, yeah. On coming to the house, they saw the child with his mother Mary, and they bowed down and worshiped him. This is an interesting thing. The worship of the Magi, these were not, I think probably they had a sense of God, but they were not Jews, and they were not followers of God, people of God, in the same way the Jews were. And yet, they had a sense that this baby was the prophesied Messiah. One thing about this is, I think these were very learned men. I think they had studied the Jewish religion, and they extrapolated. They pulled out of their study a sense, at least, of who this baby was. And they, on the basis of that, they bowed down and worshiped him. Now, don't think of this as a curtsy. In ancient Middle Eastern culture, and even to an extent today, to bow down means you get down on your knees and you bow like a turtle. You're just there. It was an act of humility. And then they opened their treasures and presented him with gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. Well, gold we know about gold. You have to kind of historically contextualize this and bear in mind that there was currency, no paper currency, but there was currency. It was all local. So the currency of Jerusalem was not the same thing as the currency in other cities. And in fact, in Jerusalem, there was a temple currency that wasn't the same as common currency. So they didn't bring him a stack of $100 bills. They brought him gold. This, going to see a little more of his story that you already know, but this stash of gold would have been very significant to the future. Remember that Joseph was a carpenter. And in those days, carpenters were not wealthy people. As a matter of fact, there was just a tiny slice of society who were wealthy. The rest, there was no middle class. The rest were just making it day to day. And that was a category that Joseph and Mary would have been in. Frankincense. The last, the kind of the suffix of the word is incense. And frankincense was an aromatic resin that was burned as an act of worship. Myrrh was a very expensive ointment that was used primarily for burial. It was very aromatic, and the reason it was used in burial is because the objective was to mitigate the stench of the decaying dead body. All right, let's think about gold, frankincense, and myrrh. Gold could have been, and I think would have been, usable immediately, right? Frankincense, it could have been sold, and the money gained in the sale could have helped the family. Yeah. Myrrh, that was it's a little bit weird. Okay, you bring this ointment used for burial to a baby. Do you see the significance? This is a little bit prophetic, that the gold, it made a whole bunch of things possible. The frankincense, that spoke to his divinity, okay? The myrrh, that was reserved for his death. It was quite prophetic. And then, after they had done this, we don't even know how long they stayed. Was it just worship, distribute the gifts, and get back on the camels and go? I don't know, could have been. But verse 12 says, they had been warned in a dream not to go back to Herod. They returned to their country by another route. And you got to know, this didn't work for Herod, because he had a plan. He was going to find out where this kid was and eliminate him. But he couldn't. All right. There's more here, and more here. Anyway, come back to it next time on So Care with Stevie Boy.